right, welcome to the webinar. I'm Maureen McCarthy. I'm the Director of Best Practices and Advancement at the Council of Graduate Schools, and I'm just going to go over our plan for today very quickly. We have a presentation of approximately 30 minutes by David Payne of ETS, which will be followed by a question and answer period. You can submit questions at any time during David's talk through the GoToWebinar panel. And we will make the recording and slides available to you via email as well as on the CGS website. If you're having any technical issues, please contact GoToWebinar via the link that's on the screen. And if you're having trouble hearing us, you can switch to a different connection at any time during the webinar. With that, I will turn the presentation over to the CGS president, Suzanne Ortega, who will introduce Dr. Payne.
Welcome, colleagues. We're so happy you joined us for this important conversation, and thanks to ETS for sponsoring today's webinar. As most of you know, CGS and ETS have enjoyed a very strong and long-standing partnership. I think it's pretty remarkable that the CGS GRE Graduate Enrollment and Degrees Survey this year will be in its 32nd continuous year. It's also the case that this year we will be co-hosting the 12th Strategic Leaders Global Summit on Graduate Education in partnership also with the University of Johannesburg. The theme this year, I think, is a particularly and always timely one, given an interesting twist by its location in sub-Saharan Africa, and the theme is supporting diversity in graduate education. Of course, the challenge of diversifying the pool of graduate students is one that transcends questions of only race and ethnicity. Diversity and inclusion is certainly about intellectual diversity and diversity of perspective. It certainly has implications for the future of the professorate as well as the global knowledge economy. It requires, of course, attention to how we recruit students, but most especially it requires our attention to fostering learning environments that provide access and support, equity for all current and future graduate students. That process, of course, once again begins at graduate admission, but given our larger goal of supporting students throughout the life cycle, how do we decide what to value, what to measure, how we measure it in the admissions process? A strategy that many graduate schools have been employing is holistic application review. Now, that's a simple term, but it covers a lot of terrain. The process takes many forms, but essentially means looking at what a student brings to a program, including academic process, but also the special skills and unique perspective, attributes such as persistence or creativity, that are signals of their potential success, but also of their ability to contribute to the multiple and diverse perspectives that enrich a graduate program. CGS issued a report on holistic review in graduate education in 2016, and I really strongly encourage you to visit the cgsnet.org website, our website, to take a look and remind yourselves of some of the findings from that overview of the issue. ETS, of course, has also been working on helping graduate programs decide what to value in admissions and how to measure it. And that's what David will talk with us about today. I am happy to introduce at this point David Payne, Vice President and Chief Operating Officer, Global Division of ETS.
Great. Thank you, Suzanne. And thank you and your team for this opportunity. On behalf of the GRE program at ETS, I'm delighted to welcome everyone to our presentation titled, Does Testing Serve a Purpose in Holistic Application Review? And we can move ahead to the next slide. In this presentation, I'll share a sampling of promising practices that aim to address the hurdles that prevent institutions from implementing a truly holistic application process. Some of these practices were developed from our research of existing challenges and practices and curated by ETS based on our own experiences, and some practices were shared with us by deans and faculty at institutions that are successfully using them now. The practices that I'll be sharing today cover three main areas: goal setting, increasing understanding, and the application review. We also have a new website, holisticadmissions.org, where we will continue to share additional promising practices as they become available. I'll cover more on that later. But before we begin the actual presentation, we'd like to take a quick poll of everyone on the webinar. So in this poll, we'd like you to answer the question, do you employ holistic admissions practices in your graduate programs? And we'd like you to select from one of the four options. Yes, all of the programs. Yes, some of the programs. No, but we're considering doing so soon. Or we have no plans to do so at this time. So we'll take a moment and let the webinar participants respond. And I'm told at some point we'll see the actual results appearing. Oh, okay, thank you very much. You've got them. So it appears from this that the majority say some of your programs are using holistic admissions, and then after that, about a third say that all are using them. So between those two, we've got about 75% of the programs for those people on the webinar, either all of their programs are using them or some are. So that's good news. But we've also got about 20% that are not considering them at this time or considering doing some soon. So hopefully with this mix of people, the presentation that we're going to go through now will add some value. So if we could move to the next slide, please. So let's start with some background for this work. In our research, we had three main project goals. First, to learn more about current admissions practices and the challenges facing those involved in the admissions process. Second, we wanted to understand how the GRE General Test and other tests are currently being used. And then third, and perhaps most importantly, we wanted to curate and develop practices that admissions committees can use as they move towards a more holistic graduate admissions process. To developing our promising practices, we conducted extensive research about admissions practices and test use. I'd like to stop here for a moment and thank GRE board members for being kind enough to grant us access to their faculty and staff to inquire about the admissions processes on their individual campuses. This was invaluable help to us. And over the past year, the GRE program teams, along with our colleagues in ETS Research and Development, Marketing, Market Research, and Client Relations, conducted 71 in-person interviews at a total of 8 institutions. Of the 71 interviews, 13 of them were with deans and staff from graduate schools admissions teams, and 58 were interviews with faculty in various disciplines, as indicated on the slide. These interviews included between 1 and 5 participants each and averaged about an hour in length. We also conducted a very extensive literature review of published studies that describe admissions processes dating back to the early 1950s, and including some of the latest research works that have emerged about holistic file review. I present this information for you to consider how these curated practices and examples might reflect or differ from the practices at your institution. Our literature review research and campus market research focused on these 5 key areas. First, the types of materials that are collected as part of the applications process. Second, the variety of admissions models that are used to make admissions decisions currently. Third, the highly decentralized nature of graduate admissions on many campuses. Fourth, the training and tools used by graduate admissions committees to support the admissions process. And finally, program perspectives on admitting diverse applicants to their program. Now, we understand that the admissions period is hectic, to say the least. During our research, we heard about many challenges and constraints. For some institutions, the sheer volume of applications seems to increase year over year, and the number of available faculty and staff to review applications does not similarly increase. Lack of time and the need for careful spending further constrain the situation. Other institutions face a lot of communications challenges due to the highly decentralized nature of their admissions process. Our promising practices came from institutions that are facing these exact same challenges and constraints, and so our recommendations also keep these challenges and constraints in mind. And what we'd like to do at this point is take another quick poll. So what we'd like you to respond to is, what are your biggest challenges in achieving your best admissions practices? And select one from these 5. Is it overtaxed faculty and staff? Is it lack of time? Does it have to do with spending on admissions? Does it have to do with the sheer volume of the application numbers? or there are communications challenges. So what we'd like you to do is just indicate which of these is the biggest challenge, and many of you will face multiples, but which is the largest one on your campus. And here are the results of the quick poll. So in terms of the item with the highest number of votes, it's overtaxed faculty and staff, and that's interesting that it was nearly 50% of the webinar participants said that that was the biggest challenge that they had. After that, lack of time and application volume seemed to be the next ones, and communication challenges also. It's also interesting to note that spending does not seem to be the issue. So it really seems to be time issues, application volumes, and the amount of time we can spend on those, and then communications challenges. So obviously all of these are contributing to the challenges that you're seeing on your campus, so this is helpful information for us. Now, we certainly understand that each institution is unique, and for that reason, I'm going to provide you with a range of ideas and options for you to consider whether your institution already has established holistic review processes for your programs, or if you've yet to begin your journey towards creating such processes. And we'd like to start with talking about goal setting, working together to set the goals and then the strategies to achieve those goals. Our campus visits that we conducted were so informative because we were able to talk with many people from various perspectives from the administration and also the program viewpoint. Despite the best intentions to communicate well by all of these parties, the lack of time to adequately plan, prepare for, and then engage in various admissions activities left the potential for significant knowledge gaps regarding how institutional goals should be connected to and reflected in the admissions process at the program level. By starting early in the admissions cycle and working together to establish enrollment goals, each program faculty committee can create guiding principles for the entire admissions process, and that includes everything from recruitment through enrollment. With these goals clearly articulated, faculty can then set the strategies for how to achieve those goals. For example, if your institution has as a goal to increase enrollment of a certain population, for example, international learners, what process or processes will your institution follow to identify and recruit individuals from that population? Or if your program wants to enroll more people with a certain type of work experience or who possess a particular personal attribute, how will your institution find those people and then recruit them? And how will these skills and attributes be measured? Your guiding principles can outline the role and importance of each component of an application file, or an applicant file rather. For example, if you're looking for that certain type of work experience, perhaps the applicant's work history should be more important than their undergraduate grade point average or their standardized test scores. Or if you're determined to enroll more people who are motivated and self-sufficient, perhaps the personal statement that the applicant submits or the letters of recommendation should rate higher. Once you've established goals and the guiding principles, you can use them to inform every step of the process and then check from time to time to make sure everything ladders up or is related as it should be. I'm very pleased to let you know that we have a new resource to share with you that can help with goal setting and facilitate the conversations needed to connect your admissions practices with these goals. During our campus visits, we posed about 25 questions to the administration and faculty teams involved in the admissions process. A number of the people who were interviewed said that our questions prompted them to consider issues and discuss issues that they hadn't discussed before or perhaps they hadn't thought about in a long time. They told us that these questions and the resulting discussions that followed were very valuable to them. In response to this feedback from the individuals on campus, we created this discussion guide that you can use to reflect upon the admissions process at your institution and engage your colleagues in a thoughtful discussion. You can download your complimentary copy of the new website that I mentioned earlier, www.holisticadmissions.org. Now let's move on to promising practices around increasing understanding. One thing that came up in our campus visits was the importance of communicating early in the admission cycle and ensuring all members of the admission committee receive training on important information each year. We recognize that this is particularly important since on many campuses, memberships on admissions committees can change year over year and different individuals are involved each time around. Getting together to make sure everyone understands the application review and selection process seems to be essential to having a successful admission cycle. Those involved in the application review process need to understand the role and importance of each component of the application, but also in which order those components should be reviewed. Reviewing a set of application materials in a different order can have a very meaningful and significant impact on the resulting decision due to the framing effect, in which reviewers may react to a particular choice in different ways depending on how it is presented. Reviewers should also be aware of appropriate and inappropriate inferences that can be made about each component of an application, and in an example of this will be provided in just a moment. All participants should also be reminded of the role that unconscious or implicit bias can play in the review and selection process, and how to mitigate it, and what the process is to resolve any disagreements about an applicant's file that may arise within the review committee. On a related note, the efforts that institutions such as yours are making towards clarifying expectations, processes, and desired outcomes as suggested through our promising practices can lay the groundwork to make expectations, processes, and desired outcomes more transparent to your applicants as well. As many of you know, Barbara Lovitz in groundbreaking research looks at the role of communicating expectations about doctoral dissertation to candidates. Lovitz advocated that doctoral programs should share the rubrics with their graduate students to clarify performance expectations, and through that transparency, help them achieve higher levels of accomplishment. This has had a significant impact on the dissertation phase of graduate education, and we believe that that transparency can do the same with the admissions practice. Now, continuing with the promising practices around increasing understanding, let's look at an example of appropriate and inappropriate inferences that can be made about each component of the application. If your institution is determined to recruit more people with a desired attribute, such as grit, for example, you might determine that you're going to look for signs in the application that this person has the motivation to keep moving forward despite the hurdles encountered in life. To make sure that the application addresses this attribute, you might want to decide to specifically call out this request in the letter of recommendation template. You might say, please rate this person from 1 to 5 on the attribute of grit, and describe the likelihood that this person will be motivated to overcome hurdles or challenges to be successful. And then you might also ask the letter writer to please provide examples if possible. The letter of recommendation now becomes a component that is related to the desired attribute that you're seeking, in this case, grit. It's just as important to identify which components are unrelated to that attribute. For example, a person shouldn't be determined not to have grit because they didn't demonstrate that characteristic in their personal statement if the instructions for writing a personal statement didn't make that explicit request. The same logic, of course, holds for letters of recommendation. If the recommender does not talk about grit and you did not ask them to, you should not be inferring that the applicant does not show significant evidence of grit. Let's move on to the promising practices around application review. Admissions test scores, like GRE scores, can enable institutions to be more inclusive in their admissions decisions by allowing objective comparisons of students from different backgrounds. However, programs receive a large number of applications need to narrow the applicant pool down to a more manageable size, and they often use the GRE test to set a cut score to achieve this. This set of promising practices suggests alternate ways to review applications without over-reliance on this single factor. The first suggestion is to add another component besides GRE scores to your cut score standard. So, for example, instead of only considering GRE scores, add in another component or two, such as GPA or a letter of recommendation. This is very beneficial because it lessens the reliance upon the GRE test scores in isolation. And if you add a measure like letters of recommendation, then you're also including some measures of non-cognitive skills or personal attributes in the initial criteria for narrowing the applicant pool. Unless your goal is to recruit students who purely fulfill a cognitive requirement, it makes sense to ensure that the initial pool narrowing takes your other goals into consideration. The next suggestion is to quantify traditionally qualitative components. Using a letter of recommendation as an example again, many institutions attempt to quantify part of it by asking reviewers to rate applicants on a number of skills or attributes, such as analytical ability, breadth of knowledge, verbal and written expression skills, perseverance, maturity, imagination, creativity, or the potential as a scholar or researcher. Another promising practice is to use a rubric that weights each component in alignment with your enrollment goals. And I'll show an example of that in the slides that follow. Regarding the order in which these components are reviewed, the campus visit research we did and the literature review identified instances of GRE scores being considered at the end of the review process so that application reviewers would not overweight GRE scores and neglect other data that is more qualitative in nature. And finally, I'll share a few suggestions regarding ways in which you can alter your overall review process to make sure that you're meeting your admissions goals. So this slide presents a sample rubric for illustrative purposes, which shows one way to compare and consider applications while reviewing multiple components without over-reliance on any one component. This example is for a school or program that would prefer to enroll students who have already had some experience with research, either as an undergrad student or through work or internship experience. And so the sample rubric reflects the high value that the institution places on research. In this example, you can also see some of the other components of the application and the maximum number of points that applicants can receive for each. So if you look at these, there's a clear indication of what the component is, what the maximum scores that could be awarded for those, and then the total possible that any candidate could get, in this case, 25 points. Now, if we look at this expanded version of the sample rubric, again, for illustrative purposes only, we're not advocating this is the way that you should set this up, but this is for illustrative purposes. We can see that the program here has assigned point values. So if the student has at least 1 year of undergraduate research and has done research through a work or intern experience, that person is given 3 points. If the candidate also has publications or posters, awards, or other presentations, she or he can then earn an extra point or 2. In the undergraduate curriculum row, you can see how someone might get an extra point for going to an undergraduate institution with a particularly challenging set of coursework. In the right column, the institution here is showing that it values qualitative and analytical writing skills above verbal reasoning skills by the way that the points are allocated. This institution set the maximum points for GRE quantitative measure at 2. You can tell by the score band that this institution is looking for higher scores on the quantitative measure. Reviewers in this case should also deduct a point for scores under the 142 mark at this institution. On the other hand, this institution also shows that it values quantitative reasoning less by setting the maximum point possible at 1 and allowing scores that receive 1 point to fall within a much broader band of scores. In this case, no negative points are given. This doesn't mean that the institution doesn't care about this measure at all, but rather that it's giving these other factors less weight. If you look in the bottom right dark blue box, that clearly indicates the total score ranges where reviewers can make recommendations for admittance. Now, another idea we'd like to describe to you is in regard to how you can consider promising practices in terms of adjusting your process that the program uses to evaluate the application information. And we'll go over 3 of these. The first, or multi-stage process, might be helpful to institutions or programs that want to target certain populations who typically do not score well on the GRE test. This multi-stage process uses an initial set of criteria to narrow the pool of candidates. Then, from the group that didn't make this initial cut, reviewers can go back and identify additional candidates who exhibit other desired skills or attributes. Both groups are then reviewed holistically. The second approach, the two-pool process, acknowledges that multiple institutions will likely target the populations you've identified as desirable Excuse me. So under these conditions, it may be best to act quickly to extend offers to these individuals for admission. In the two-pool process, programs first pool files for the target populations to accelerate the holistic review of those applications. Then the program can focus on the remaining population. The third approach that we'd like to discuss here is the separate and convene process. This acknowledges and seeks to avoid the framing bias that we referred to earlier. In this process, separate committee members review different components of the application, then convene to discuss the applicants. For example, committee member A might review components of the application that contain quantitative factors, cognitive factors such as GPA, GRE scores, or transcripts. And then committee members B and C review components of the application that contain non-cognitive factors such as, for example, lab or research experience, the nature of the letters of recommendation, the statement of purpose, or the CV that's included. When the two groups of reviewers convene, applicants who receive high marks from both groups should sit high in the consideration set for final consideration. I hope that some of the practices shared in this presentation will inspire you to reflect on your own institution's or program's admissions process and perhaps even spark a change. We want to acknowledge that change is never easy. It takes time and it takes leadership, but we believe, and the GRE board believes, that there are many benefits to adopting some of the practices shared here, and that these benefits will be extended to the students, the program, and also the overall institutions that adopt these practices. As I indicated earlier, we've launched a new website to support the dissemination of our promising practices and to provide these support materials to the graduate community. On the holisticadmissions.org webpage, you'll find these additional resources to get you started, including our newest infographic for using GRE scores during your admissions process, and the discussion guide that I mentioned earlier in the webinar. Going forward, we will continue to populate the holisticadmissions.org website, as noted earlier, and we'll be putting up additional information about holistic review, including other promising practices that we're working on presently. And if you have practices at your institution or your program that you consider promising, and they address challenges and constraints that other institutions face, we'd appreciate it if you would share those with us. We would like to make our promising practices repository as robust as possible, representing a range of ideas to address the challenges and constraints in holistic admissions practices that everyone is facing today. You can send these promising practices to us by submitting them to gretests@ets.org, or if they're brief enough, you may also want to share them using the Q&A feature, and the CGS team can capture those and then read or share them with the group. Finally, I want to acknowledge that we are always ready to try to help in this endeavor. Our team can be reached at gretests@ets.org or by phone at 609-683-2002. We're happy to respond to your inquiries and consider your comments, ideas, and suggestions. I also want to note that we'd be delighted to arrange to have this presentation delivered on your campus by a member of our GRE Client Relations team. Also, a version of this presentation is available on the holisticadmissions.org website. Finally, I'd like to thank my CGS colleagues for this opportunity and to all of you for listening in today. I hope that you found value in the information I presented, and I encourage you to visit holisticadmissions.org to access the resources that I've just summarized. Please also let us hear from you about your ideas and other ways that ETS can support your holistic admissions practices. And now with that, let's see what questions you may have for us for the remainder of the webinar today.
Well, while we're waiting for questions to come in, David, I think I'll start with one that's been on my mind. As I recall, a number of years ago, GRE introduced the Personal Potential Index, PPI I think it was called, that was intended to measure important non-cognitive skills. I also think you stopped offering the PPI largely because graduate programs weren't using it. There wasn't quick or robust uptake. Is ETS still looking for ways to measure non-cognitive skills? And if you are, can you say anything about it?
Certainly, Suzanne. Thank you for that question. You're completely right that the GRE program did introduce the first standardized assessments of non-cognitive skills for use in a high-stakes arena, in this case, graduate and professional admissions. And it also is the case that one of the things we learned through that initiative is that, in fact, change in graduate admissions practices is challenging. We did not see significant uptake of the personal potential index, even though that tool was available at no additional cost to the test takers or to the score users. However, we did not give up after we took the PTI, or personal potential index, off the market. We have had outstanding support from the GRE board, and they've strongly encouraged us to continue looking at other ways of measuring non-cognitive skills. And we are currently engaged with the board and are going to be in June presenting them with prototypes for other approaches to measure non-cognitive skills. And we're really continuing to work on this. We will use the guidance and feedback from the board to make decisions in terms of which of these approaches we move forward with. But I think everyone would agree that currently in graduate admissions, we don't capture all of the important information about applicants, and there have to be better ways to measure these important attributes, and we are committed to finding better ways of doing that.
So, David, we have a question from the audience here. You talked about visiting campuses and talking to individuals at universities about their processes. Did you come across any groups that you would consider models of good holistic admissions processes?
Well, that's a great question, and I appreciate the webinar participant who sent it in. During the campus visits, we found that there were many promising practices that were working quite well, but we also found that for many of the programs, they would point to part of their practices that were working quite well and other parts that they weren't quite as happy with. So, for example, they may have a very effective review process, but they may feel that their communication among committee members is less than ideal. So what we've tried to do is to identify those best practices and promote those, and then let programs and graduate schools decide which are the ones that would be the best to try to introduce into their specific context. Lots of the campuses and programs that we visited were doing outstanding work, but I think all of them would agree that none of them had reached the perfection state, and all of them were continuing to strive to improve some dimension of their holistic review. And over time, this is going to have to evolve, and the specific promising practices that we're putting forward will be relevant at different levels at different institutions, and it's really important for programs to try to match what problems they're trying to address with the specific promising practices that will be most impactful for those specific issues.
Thank you. We have another question. What advice would you give to a graduate program whose leadership claims that because the numbers of applicants are so large, it's impossible to do anything else than a quick GRE sort to identify the most promising candidates? They're looking for advice for crafting the argument about improving their admitted pool through a more holistic process.
And that's a particular situation that we run into time and time again for highly competitive programs that get large numbers of applications and simply don't have the resources, either faculty, staff, or student resources, or the time to go through all of the applications in a completely holistic manner. And what we've tried to identify is that recognizing that that is a reality facing many programs, how can there be a two-stage process where the first stage does not end up with a very narrow group of students who are then promoted to the second, more holistic phase? And some of the examples that I gave earlier, for example, if you're going to have a two-step process like that, rather than strictly relying on GRE scores, add in another component that can be combined with a GRE score, so you're looking at more than what skills are measured on the GRE general test. For example, letters of recommendation, if they could be evaluated and quantified relatively quickly, that might be combined so you get a non-cognitive dimension to put with the cognitive or academic credentials measured by the GRE. Or if that doesn't work and you really need to go with a readily available quantitative measure, you might consider using grade point average. What you want to avoid doing is just basing those initial cuts based on GRE scores. The reason being that if we look at the performance differences across different subpopulations, if you strictly rely on GRE scores alone and don't take other measures into account, your ultimate pool of candidates that get reviewed in the second phase will probably not be as diverse as you're looking for on multiple different dimensions. So anything that can be done to make that first screen be more multifaceted will result in a richer pool of candidates that are evaluated in the second phase. The other practice that programs can look at is by going and looking at what are the characteristics of students in the past that have been successful in their program. And rather than setting arbitrary cut scores, try to identify scores, either grade point averages or GRE scores, that are associated with success in the program, and use that to guide you if you are going to be setting cut scores. But I think the largest and most significant change that programs could make would be to move away from over-reliance on GRE as a single cut score and incorporate other forms of evidence about the attributes and skills of the candidates in that initial evaluation.
Thank you. We have a couple more questions about different areas of best practice. One is, what kind of application strategies are effective in recruiting first-generation students?
Well, Maureen, I think that you hit on in your question there a key component to it, and that is in looking at how you're going to try to enroll first-generation students, there needs to be an active outreach to try to get those students to apply to your programs. So looking, for example, at the McNair Scholars Program is a good way of looking at first-generation students. And there are multiple ways that you can do this. I'll mention a couple. One is you could take advantage of the GRE Search Service, which is a way to identify candidates who have certain characteristics, and then you can proactively recruit those students. Another would be faculty oftentimes have connections at other institutions where they know people who are working with undergraduate students, and if they can do outreach through their professional network, that may help. So there are multiple ways of doing it, but I think the most important factor to keep in mind is that we can't simply rely on those applications that happen to show up at the graduate school or at the program. It requires proactive work to go out and get those students and encourage those students to apply. The other reality of this that I think is important to acknowledge is that virtually all graduate faculty also teach undergraduate courses, and they will come across first-generation students. So faculty in that situation can act as mentors to students, and if you've got a talented or promising student, first generation or otherwise, encouraging them to pursue graduate education can really have a significant impact. On a personal note, I'm a first generation student, and quite honestly, the faculty that I worked with as an undergraduate who encouraged me to consider going to graduate school changed the trajectory of my life. I never had thought about graduate education until I met a couple of psychology faculty who invited me to get participation in their research labs, and I wouldn't be sitting here today were it not for those two individuals. So I can speak from personal experience that mentoring and advising at the undergraduate level can be hugely impactful.
The second question is sort of the other side of this issue, which is how can graduate schools and graduate programs ensure that the admissions committee assessing an applicant's undergraduate curriculum and their alma mater, how can you ensure that that isn't subjective or based on certain kind of bias, and giving them the kind of information that they need to be able to assess the undergraduate curriculum in a way that doesn't discriminate?
Well, again, a great question, and let me answer that question by noting several things about that. One is that it really is virtually impossible to equate across different undergraduate curriculums at different institutions in different countries the undergraduate experience in grades. We know that grade inflation has had differential effects across different disciplines. We see differential grade inflation at different types of institutions. In my experience as a faculty member and a graduate dean, we oftentimes ran into the situation where we would have applicants from other countries where we weren't familiar with the institution, and they may have a very different set of grading practices. So it's very hard to look at undergraduate grades or undergraduate grade point average as a single measure and be able to standardize those across different institutions. Quite honestly, that's one of the reasons that the GRE has value, in that that is the one standardized piece of information you're going to have. And I'm not saying that you should neglect the other information, but you have to keep in mind that when you look at the undergraduate institutions that the students are coming from, with their transcripts, their grades, etc., these are very heterogeneous. The other thing I would point out in regard to this is that when we look at certain subpopulations, first-generation students, underrepresented minority students, for example, these students oftentimes will end up applying, enrolling, and then graduating from less selective types of institutions. So if you're using the selectivity of the undergraduate institution as one of your criteria for admission, you are going to end up missing some probably high-talent students who did not go to a school that has a very strong reputation and has the benefit of a halo effect. So it's a long-winded way of saying that there isn't any one silver bullet that will allow you to look at the undergraduate records and kind of put them all on a level dimension or standardize their scores at all. It really is difficult. Now, the other thing that you will acknowledge is that faculty do become familiar with undergraduate programs in their disciplines, and they may become more familiar with certain schools that tend to send large numbers of their students onto graduate schools, and so that familiarity can help. But again, it can also blind us to those kind of diamonds in the rough who go to schools that they're not that familiar with.
That's great. David, thank you. I'm going to ask my own question, which is based on some of the discussion that we had at the CGS annual meeting this past December, which was, as you remember, David, focused on relieving the burden for recommenders. And I think part of the perception of holistic review processes is that it relies heavily on some of the subjectivity of these letters of recommendation to some extent. And as we continue to tailor the admissions processes at different institutions, there may become this sort of proliferation of different kinds of forms for recommenders, different assessments that we're asking recommenders to make. And, you know, is ETF thinking at all about the kind of echo effect of that, and how we could maybe as a community be helping to relieve the burden there?
Great question, and yes, that definitely did come up at the CGS annual meeting. And a couple of observations about that. First, and again, I'm basing this on my experience as a former faculty member and grad dean, faculty really do value letters of recommendation, and it's part of our understanding as a professional society that if you have someone, for example, who worked with a student as an undergraduate and can attest to how they performed in their research or in the laboratory, we tend to put quite a bit of weight on that. However, we also have to acknowledge that letters of recommendation are inherently subjective, meaning that if I had a student in my lab who was extraordinarily creative, I would be very likely to comment on that in my letter of recommendation. If that same student was I had less evidence about their persistence, for example, it's unlikely that I would say, Dawn was highly creative, but I have no evidence of whether or not Dawn would actually persist in the face of adversity. And so what we end up with is a representation of students in letters of recommendation that is not standardized. People tend to talk about the things that they have access to and that they can say positive things about. And also, if you look at the empirical research on letters of recommendation, while they're highly valued, there's not a lot of strong empirical support to indicate that letters of recommendation do a very good job of predicting success in graduate education for some of the reasons that I've alluded to. The other issue that I've heard over the years a lot from faculty is that faculty are feeling increasingly that they're overburdened with more and more responsibilities that they have to take on. Faculty who run large undergraduate research labs may have to write many letters of recommendations for students applying to graduate programs. And this is one of the areas where there may be some possibilities to improve the efficiency of this by having communities of scholars come together and say, what are the important dimensions for success within certain specific fields? So what's critical for success in the STEM fields may be, I'm not certain about this, but it may be different than what's critical for success in the fine arts. But if we could get faculty to agree on what the important dimensions are for success in their specific areas, we could take a page perhaps out of undergraduate admissions, where I'm sure everyone on the webinar is familiar with the Common App. This allows programs to get common sets of information from students, and then individual schools or individual programs can ask for supplemental information. But if there could be something analogous to a Common App letter of recommendation that we could use at the graduate level, that might relieve some of the workload on faculty, and it might also allow us to introduce a level of standardization that would allow us to equally compare candidates from different types of institutions. But the other thing that I want to acknowledge about this is that faculty also, and I think appropriately, have a strong feeling that oftentimes they'd like to tailor their letters of recommendation. So if they're writing a letter for a student, they would like to be able to tailor it to the specific program the student has applied to. That sounds like a great thing to do, and I think personally it probably does have an impact, but I'm willing to bet that many people on the webinar have also had the experience of reading a letter of recommendation at their institution that happened to have the name of a different program or a different institution in the letter because someone didn't take the time and energy to make sure that that tailored letter actually had the name of the appropriate institution on it. So it cuts both ways having these tailored specific letters. But to summarize, I think that we can improve the way that we're collecting information from letter writers, both in terms of its standardization, collecting data that does predict success in graduate school, and also doing it in a way that would increase the overall efficiency of the process.
David, I think as we move towards the close of the webinar, I'm going to ask what perhaps will be our final question. And that is, what is your vision? What is ETS's vision for promising practices that you'll be sharing on the holisticadmission.org website?
Our vision of this, Suzanne, is that this repository will continue to grow over time. We are vetting a number of additional promising practices that we hope to have available before the next admission cycle gets started. But more than that, we'd also like to engage with the graduate and professional community to be doing research to provide some empirical support for different promising practices. One of the things that concerns us is while the goals and the intended outcomes of a holistic file review are noble and we totally support, I do get concerned at times that programs are starting to do some very creative things and may not be taking an empirical orientation to say, is this really producing the results that we intended to produce? So I think having an empirical orientation to what we're doing around promising practices will be helpful. And as you close with the final question, I want to close with a final observation about this. And this comes from work that we've done over the years with business schools. And I won't name the particular business school, but a number of years ago I was talking to individuals from a business school that had decided that they wanted to get some information about creativity and communication skills for their applicants. So they decided on a process where they would have applicants send in, it was either a 3 or 4 slide PowerPoint presentation in response to a specific prompt. And for the first couple of years, that worked really well. And then after a couple of years, they noticed that many of the slides started looking like other slides. And the reason for that is people who are applying to graduate and professional programs are smart, and they'll do what it takes to actually make themselves look good. And in this case, students started talking to students who had gotten gotten admitted to the programs, found out what they had sent in, and then modeled their responses after those. So I think that we need, as we embrace holistic admissions, to look at, are there any unintended consequences of what we're doing? Over time, will these same approaches continue to work in a high-stakes environment? And also, are we looking at fairness and equity issues across the board for all of the approaches that we're taking? So, long way of answering, ETS is committed to working with the graduate professional community to develop these, but we're also committed to doing the empirical research to make sure that we provide evidence of how well are we achieving our stated goals.
Well, I would like to take this moment to thank you, David, and to thank ETS, and to thank all of you who are attending today's webinar. Within a week, you will receive an email with the slides from today's presentation and a link to the webinar recording, both of which will also be posted and available on the CGS webinars page. We will end the webinar now, and I'm wishing each of you a wonderful rest of your Wednesday. Thank you.